proceed.
Ladies and gentlemen, for years, kids have been skateboarding on the property of Terry Fink. You've heard testimony here today that not only did Mr. Fink know about these kids using his property, but he acquiesced in it. He liked watching them show off their fancy techniques. This was until one day he decided that he could no longer allow these kids on his property because he was responsible for their actions. The events after this decision, ladies and gentlemen, show a pattern of negligence, which was the proximate cause of the fire on the 7th of August, 1993. First, Mr. Fink never tells these kids not to skateboard on his property. These are 14, 15, and 16-year-old children, ladies and gentlemen, who have been doing it for years with the implied permission of Mr. Fink. They had no idea that they weren't allowed to use his property anymore. Darryl Claiborne had just gotten home from a vacation, from being with his sick grandmother. He had no idea that he was no longer using that property. Second, ladies and gentlemen, instead of telling these children not to use the property anymore, he decides to build a fence. But the problem, ladies and gentlemen, was that he doesn't build a very good fence. We've heard testimony here today that he got the materials for this makeshift fence at a junkyard, that he had a man whom he fired for being drunk on the job, Mr. Sam Hendricks, help him put up that fence. And it's no wonder, ladies and gentlemen, that 4 days after its completion, it's starting to come apart. You've heard testimony here today that Mr. Fink does nothing to remedy this problem, that his fence was coming apart. And why? Because on that day, the Department of Environmental Resources paid another visit to what had become all too familiar turf. The DER came, not for the first time, not for the second time, but for the third time to cite Mr. Fink for violating the same offense, for having flammable paint products too close to the heating element. You know, in his affidavit, Terry Fink states that a lawsuit should teach Darryl Claiborne a lesson. Well, maybe Mr. Fink needs to learn a few lessons himself. On the evening of August 7th, 1993, you have heard testimony here today that Terry Fink had those paint cans 3 feet away from that heating element. And ladies and gentlemen, the plaintiff has admitted today to having cleaning products 3 feet from that heating element and a stack of newspapers 1 to 2 feet from that element, which the fire marshal concludes helped defeat the fire. Ladies and gentlemen, Terry Fink left his shop like a tinderbox, and it was just waiting to go up. You know, the old adage says, 3 strikes and you're out. Well, Terry Fink got his 3 warnings from the DER, and on the 7th of August, unfortunately, his luck ran out. Ladies and gentlemen, you are here today to determine facts and to seek the truth. Facts. Everything that I have just told you are facts. In contrast, the plaintiff would have you draw your conclusions based on pure speculation and conjecture. They have been able to prove that Darryl was indeed on that property. And they've been able to prove that, in fact, Darryl's skateboard did go into Mr. Fink's shop. But that's it. They have not been able to prove that his skateboard was the direct cause of that fire. And that is what they need to prove. They have the burden to prove that. They have not been able to do that here today. Ladies and gentlemen, by Pennsylvania state law, you must weigh the facts. And if you find that 50% or more, more than 50% of responsibility is on the plaintiff for that fire, you must find in favor of the defense. And clearly, the evidence, not the speculation, the evidence lies with the plaintiff and lies with the defense here today. And that is why I ask you to find the only fair verdict in favor of the defendant, Mr. Darryl Claiborne. It would not be doing justice if we just surmise the fact that Darryl's skateboard caused that fire. There's no proof, ladies and gentlemen. There's just no proof. Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Would the plaintiff like to make some closing remarks to the jury? Very well.
Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as introduced by my co-counsel, I am Rosanna Termina. I'd like to begin by thanking you for the time and attention that you've paid to this case. A case which at first glance may seem a little complicated, and rather unbelievable. And there's a very good reason for this. A great deal of it is. A great deal of the defendant's version is unbelievable. On July 2nd, 1993, Mr. Terry Fink, owner and operator of Fink's Auto Body Repair and Paint Shop, put up a fence. The fence had a gate, and the gate had a lock. Mr. Fink made certain that this fence surrounded his entire property, including the incline next to his garage. He did this because he didn't want it to be used as a skateboarding ramp by neighborhood children. And he even posted a no skateboarding permitted sign so that they would be sure to get the message. On August 7, 1993, Darrell Claiborne, the defendant, got that message, and he ignored it. When he and Tracy Attila arrived at Mr. Fink's property that night, Darrell remarked that he saw a fence that surrounded Mr. Fink's entire property, a fence that separated Darrell from a place in which he had no permission to be, a fence which Darrell admitted meant stay out. And without making any attempt to contact Mr. Fink, Darrell proceeded to crawl through a hole in this fence and use Mr. Fink's incline without permission. Once inside the fence, Tracy and the rest of her friends watched as Darrell made his first skateboarding run. Now this incline was so steep that it frightened even Tracy, an avid skateboarder with high aspirations and competitive skiing. However, she stayed and watched as Darrell tried to impress her, and impress her he did. On his way down the hill, Darrell lost his balance. Darrell's skateboard flew up into the air and crashed through a window of Mr. Fink's garage. At that point, Darrell's skateboard knocked over several cans of paint lying inside the garage just under the window. And Darrell's skateboard caused these cans of paint to leak fluid, releasing combustible fumes into the air. The rest, ladies and gentlemen, is literally history. That night, in response to a phone call, Mr. Fink rushed out to his auto body shop only to find a raging fire. He was forced to watch as his life went up in flames. The next day, Fire Marshal Blaze Weed was sent to investigate the fire, and he found overturned paint cans whose lids he concluded did not come off by force of explosion. Then what was nearby these paint cans? A skateboard. And whose skateboard was it? Since Darrell's skateboard was the only one we know entered the garage that night, and since Darrell could not produce his skateboard when asked, who else's could it have been? Fire Marshal Lee concluded that the role of the skateboard in the ignition of the fire was likely, but that he cannot be sure. Ladies and gentlemen, in all fairness to Mr. Weed, let's remember that he knows and likes Darrell Claiborne, and that his inconclusiveness about the skateboard in the fire gives Darrell a little room to maneuver. Based on the evidence that you've heard today, you can be sure that the skateboard was Darrell's, and that the skateboard caused the fire. Furthermore, Darrell was given plenty of time before he was finally interviewed by Blaze Weed about the night of the fire. And what was the result of this time? Well, Darrell came up with a great story about what happened when everyone left, when there was no one there to see him. Darrell says that he left Mr. Fink's property. And then Darrell says that he came back to fetch his skateboard, to fix his skateboard, and then to use his skateboard for a few more runs down Mr. Fink's hill. Darrell says that he did all of this when just a half an hour before he was hiding in the woods, scared to death that the police were going to show up at that very same place. Then, on his way home, Darrell says that he conveniently threw his skateboard in a dumpster. Now, what we do know is that when Darrell got home, he didn't call the police. He didn't call Mr. Fink, and he didn't even tell his mom what had happened that night. When asked to produce his skateboard, he could not. Darrell says that the dumpster had probably been emptied recently. The truth is, there was nothing in that dumpster to begin with. Ladies and gentlemen, later on, the judge will instruct you as to the legal definition of the word negligence. Pennsylvania statutes define negligence as the absence of ordinary care which a reasonably prudent person would exercise under the circumstances. Darrell's actions were not reasonable, they were not prudent, and they were not innocent. Ladies and gentlemen, Darrell's actions were negligent. And furthermore, Darrell knows that what he did was wrong. And as a result of his negligent actions, another man's life, Mr. Terry Fink's life, went up in smoke. Now, Darrell Claiborne is a very clever boy. His story is almost theoretically perfect, but still a long way from believable. The fact is that Darrell told no one this story until he knew he was caught, until the police found him out. Darrell thinks that his story represents the perfect alibi. But in real life, rarely is anything so perfect. Unless, of course, it originates in the mind of a scared 16-year-old boy who fears being discovered. Ladies and gentlemen, Darrell's story is already fooling young people. Don't let it fool you. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor.
Members of the jury, at this point, you've heard the evidence that's been presented in the case, as well as the opposing arguments of counsel. So at this point, I would ask you to be kind enough to retire and begin your deliberations. We Counsel, it's my understanding that the jury has been able to reach a verdict and determination in regard to this matter, so at this point, I would ask that the jury would be returned to the court. Members of the jury, it's the court's understanding that you have been able to reach a verdict in regard to this matter.
That's correct, Your Honor.
Very well, I'd ask the four-person jury to announce the verdict.
Your Honor, the winner of this competition is Norristown High School.